Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. And now, here is Walter Bingham.
Hello and welcome to the program for June 29th, 2021, the 19th of Tammuz, 5781. I am Walter Bingham and look forward to spend the next hour in your company. Recent events concerning our government have not been easy to accept by our people. There are those who believe that Netanyahu has been unfairly targeted by a conspiracy to oust him from the premiership. Actually, his opponents said as much. In fact, the only thing that united the supporters of our so-called new government was to remove Netanyahu from Balfour Street. For many months, the demonstrations outside his official residence disrupted traffic in the capital. Then there are those citizens for whom the Lapid-Bennett government is an anathema, a travesty of supposed Zionist policy. The Trojan horse, the Arab Ram Party within government, has already unloaded some of its dangerous content. A key phrase uttered by their leader, Mansour Abbas, is that, quote, "We expect that our partners show a positive approach towards the demands of Arab society." In its charter, Ram denounces Zionism as a racist ideology and demands the right of return for Palestinians expelled, as they call it, in 1948. In return for their vote in the new government, they expect the legalization of Arab construction in the Negev, but no settlement expansion in Area C of Judea and Samaria, and the cessation of expulsion of Arab residents in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem, that's our Shimon HaTzadik area, regardless of the law. This is just a starter. Unlike other Islamist movements which seek to destroy Israel by force and terrorism, the Ram Party is using the democratic process to achieve the same aim. That method is far more dangerous because it fakes cooperation but aspires to the same cause, a Palestinian state to replace Israel. It's in fact the methods the Nazis used to come to power. And that is not the only leaf the Arabs took out of the book of Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. We have to go into a break, but there's a lot more to come.
Israel is located in one of the most volatile areas in the world. Israel is an island of stability in a sea of war and unrest. In the midst of this turmoil, Israel stands out as a beacon of order and human progress. Each week we update you on what's happening in this, the Jewish state, a true light unto the nations. This is Jay Shapiro. Join me every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
And now, here is Walter Bingham.
For the first time ever, an Israeli minister has ordered the LGBTQ rainbow flag to be flown alongside Israel's national flag from his ministry. It was not surprisingly Israel's foreign minister and alternate Prime Minister Yair Lapid of the Yesh Atid party, who ordered his officials to fly that flag to mark the so-called Pride Month, a month to celebrate abnormal sexual practices. That is supposed to bring a message of tolerance, brotherhood and freedom. Of course, our Deputy Foreign Minister, Idan Roll, is homosexual. Perhaps the next step of this double-dealing government will be to fly the rainbow flag at all official events, because Idan Roll claims the Foreign Office occasion is an important step, both at home and abroad. Compare that with the difficulties that were encountered to march through the streets of our capital city with our national flags once a year. At this point, I want to add that I have no problem with members of LGBTQ community living their lifestyle in private behind closed doors. It is their public display and their insistence of official recognition as an influential group that is, in my view, unacceptable. I also believe that flying the flag at the Foreign Office is less to display tolerance, brotherhood, and freedom than building a voter base. Unusually, I begin this segment with a reference to my article in the Jerusalem Post titled, "Does the World Need Israel?" In it, I listed the many achievements of both Jews in general and Israel in particular, and that humanity requires us to share its benefits with the world. Well, with great foresight, the founder of modern Zionism, Im Tirtzu, ended his book, Der Judenstaat, with these words: "The Jews who wish for a state will have it. We shall live at last as free men on our own soil and die peacefully in our own homes. The world will be freed by our liberty, enriched by our wealth, magnified by our greatness, and whatever we attempt there to accomplish for our own welfare will react powerfully and beneficially for the good of humanity." And in his book Alt Neuland, Herzl wrote, "If you will it, it is not a dream." The first part of this phrase translated into Hebrew is Im Tirtzu, and that is the name of a very active and successful Zionist grassroots organization in Israel. To learn more about the work and achievements of Im Tirtzu, I am pleased to have as my guest Im Tirtzu's Director of External Relations and Development, Eitan Meir. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before I come to some of the details of Im Tirtzu's work, when was it established, by whom, and what is the declared mission?
Im Tirtzu was established in 2006 by a couple of people. The main person who spearheaded it is Dr. Ronen Shoval, who was then a student at Hebrew University. It was shortly after the Second Lebanon War when there was a feeling of oppression in the country. The war, we didn't do as well. They realized that something was missing. So Ronen and a few others started this organization in Hebrew University, and the idea was to rejuvenate the justness of the Zionist cause, that people would be proud to be Israeli and they would believe in the cause of Zionism. And ever since, really, the motto of Im Tirtzu has sort of been two-pronged. One is to do good, and the other is to prevent the bad. When we talk about doing good, we talk about education. We have many tours to Hebron and to Jerusalem. We have many seminars. We're active in 20 college campuses in Israel. The mission is to strengthen and defend Zionism and to protect Israel as a Jewish and democratic state.
Now, you consider yourselves grassroots. Does that mean you have a membership?
We call ourselves grassroots because I would say 6,000 to 7,000 activists across the country every year. It grows. Activists on campuses and, of course, off campuses. Many organizations do great work, but they're just a few people sitting in an office. And that's why we're really grassroots, because it all comes from the bottom up. It comes from all the activists and really the people of Israel in general. We have the largest Facebook page out of any pro-Israel organization in Israel and in Hebrew. We have a very high media profile. People see the logo, Theodore Herzl's face, and they think Im Tirtzu, and they know us, and that's very helpful. People who just want to do good, who just want to influence the country in a good way.
Is it mainly the younger generation that you have as activists?
They're the ones that are more organized, the lectures on campuses, and I would say attend the more protests. But we have a large group. Again, we've been around since 2006. So if someone was a student in 2006, now they're much older than that. They're already possibly in their 40s and their late 30s. We have a large group of the older generation who are part of our civilian branches, as we call them, who are always participating in our activities.
One of your recent activities was being involved in organizing this year's Jerusalem Flag March, which caused a great deal of controversy that is still being felt today. What is the march all about?
The march, first and foremost, really is a tremendous educational celebration of the reunification and liberation of Jerusalem. A lot of the controversy we heard was from the foreign media who was talking about it. We're provoking the residents here, or of course Hamas, who threatened to attack Israel if the march would take place. It's a very ungrateful attitude. Jerusalem under Israeli sovereignty has never been more free, has never been more open, ironically not for Jews on the Temple Mount, but that's a whole separate issue. It allows all the foreign press to come there and then stay in their fancy hotels and live the good life. And if Jerusalem would be under Jordanian occupation, if it would be under the rule of the Palestinian Authority, this wouldn't be possible. All the millions of Christians who come, all the free people of the world who want to come to celebrate Jerusalem or even to visit, that wouldn't be possible. Reunification of Jerusalem, and that's what the march is all about.
So who participates and why was it postponed and nearly cancelled?
So it was first postponed because, if you remember, the Jerusalem Day itself, there was violence in the city, and it reached its pinnacle when Hamas shot rockets on the city. So once Hamas shot rockets, everybody had to seek shelter, and the march was canceled. So we rescheduled this march, not only for the educational purposes, but also to boost the morale of the people. It wasn't only in Gaza that there was issues. I live in Lod, a mixed Arab-Israeli city, which bore the brunt, the Arab riots against Jews, and it also happened in Jaffa, and Akko, and in Haifa. The morale of the country was not at its best. So we said we have to go ahead and boost the morale of the country. And together with a bunch of other amazing organizations, we went ahead and reorganized it.
Am I right that the police let it be known that they were unable to protect the march of Jewish youth who just want to march peacefully through the streets of Israel's capital city, carrying flags and singing songs, a long-time tradition, echoing the foreign media, because it would be an insult to our Arab residents?
Well, we planned this with the outset from the police. It's important to note that we love the police. We love the security forces, of course, the IDF. So we did this. We're law-abiding citizens. This plan from the very, very outset was done with the police. The first date that we scheduled was coordinated, of course, in advance with the police. Then what happens was that Hamas threatened to shoot rockets. So then the police canceled it. And then together with the police, we arrived on a compromise. We weren't able to go through the Damascus Gate like we had wanted, and then took the route via Jaffa Gate to the Western Wall.
It's interesting that the police was concerned, and yet they blocked the city streets, causing loss to local traders in order to allow a private organization, the LGBTQ groups, to show off their unconventional lifestyle, despite the fact that their display of scantily dressed individuals offends many more Jews of all ages than the number of Arab protesters at Damascus Gate, quite apart from the large cost to the taxpayer for their police protection. Did you mention that in your representations?
We repeated the very simple point that law-abiding citizens are able to freely assemble and to freely protest. That goes for everybody who wants to do it peacefully and who wants to do it in accordance of the law. And whether it's protesting for LGBT rights or for environmental issues, or they want to go ahead and celebrate the reunification of Jerusalem, we view that law-abiding citizens should be able to do this. And the whole notion that this march was a provocation is, I believe, absurd on its face. To say that it's a provocation for Jews to march with the Israeli flags in their capital city is a provocation. I think that's absurd. The next step could be anything. You could say that it's a provocation for Jews to walk around with their kippahs, because if you're using the subjective term of provocation, then there's no end to it, because many people in this region, including many of our neighbors and the people living in Israel, don't want the Jews to be here. So if you would adopt that attitude that if it's a provocation, that means the state of Israel shouldn't exist. The same thing happened in 1948 when Ben-Gurion decided to declare independence. There were a lot of people who told him, don't do it. You're provoking all the Arabs. There's going to be a slaughter. The Jewish state is not going to make it. But he had the moral clarity and the responsibility to do what needed to be done. And the same thing was here. There was a lot of people telling us, why are you holding this march? It's a provocation. Don't you know Hamas is threatening? And we said it to ourselves something very simple. We don't want to live in a society where a terror group or criminals are dictating to us what can and what can't be done. Where could we walk and where can't we walk in our capital city? And that's why we decided to hold the march. And as we saw, Hamas's threats were empty threats. And just goes to prove that you shouldn't let all these prophecies of doom dictate your life, and especially dictate your values. Once you let Hamas or even residents of Israel or the Palestinian Authority who don't really like you so much, once you let them dictate what you can or cannot do, you already lost. You lost your values, and also you lost your state. Because as we know, deterrence is very important. Just ask Chamberlain in 1938, the famous Peace for Our Time speech, what caving to terrorists does, what appeasement does. And as everybody knows, it didn't really turn out so well. And throughout history, we all know that the policy of appeasement doesn't work out. So the more we give to Hamas, the more they take. We sent them a very clear message that, one, they're not the so-called protectors of Al-Aqsa and Jerusalem like they pretended to be. And two, they can't dictate what they can or cannot do. And that showed them a very big message, and it also humiliated them. We had a lot of reports from experts who follow the social media in Arabic, and they saw that Hamas was humiliated. You know, they had this big presentation, we're going to shoot rockets, we're going to resist, and nothing happened to them.
You're also very much involved in protecting our interests in Judea and Samaria.
Tell me about that briefly.
That's correct. The notion that people say that Jews shouldn't be allowed to live in the heartland of their ancestral homeland in Judea and Samaria is quite absurd. We're specifically involved in protecting the actual land because, as many people know, Area C in Judea and Samaria is really under assault. The Palestinian Authority, in cooperation, and they're getting support by the European Union, are really engaged in a widespread effort to steal, to grab Israeli land. And what they do is simple. They seize state land that's not being lived on, and they go ahead there, they plant some trees, they build some structures, and then they claim it as their own.
How do you do this, protecting the interest? What do you do there?
Hear the answer after this break.
The Tamar Yona Show.
Tamar? She's sassy.
She's smart.
She's funny.
But she's also a real Jewish mother.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tamar Yona. And yes, I can be all of those things, but at Israel News Talk Radio, I'm here to bring you the news stories and guests that you may not hear anywhere else. Join me live on air Sundays, Mondays, and Tuesdays for the most unique and bold talk radio in Israel.
The Tamar Yona Show.
Shalom, I'm Leah Aharoni. Join me on my show, News from the Torah. Each Sunday, we'll use the weekly Torah portion as a prism for understanding the news today. Listen to News from the Torah to gain clarity about the times we're living in and to understand your own spiritual path in the process. News from the Torah every Sunday on Israel News Talk Radio.
And now, here is Walter Bingham.
The Palestinian Authority, in cooperation, and they're getting support by the European Union, are really engaged in a widespread effort to steal, to grab Israeli land. And what they do is simple. They seize state land that's not being lived on, and they go ahead there, they plant some trees, they build some structures, and then they claim it as their own.
How do you do this, protecting the interest? What do you do there?
So there's two ways we do it. One is simply by documenting it. We document the fact that this is being done, and then we bring it to the decision makers. In the beginning of this year, the former Community Affairs Minister, Tzachi Hanegbi, announced that the government was allocating 20 million shekels to more patrols, to more drones that were going to be documenting this. And the second thing we do is we're helping these lone farmers, as we call them. There are really amazing, brave people living in Judea and Samaria, and they really go to live there with their families. I mean, last week we were at two of these places. Tomorrow we're going to another one. There's these people who left everything behind to go live in this area, and they protect it day and night. They stay up. There's also a great organization called Hashomer Judea and Samaria who sent people to go ahead and help them protect it. And what we do is we start donating trees. We give them trees to plant there. And just like what the Palestinian Arabs do is when they plant trees in order to claim their property, we're doing the same thing. Only the property actually belongs to Israel. Completely legitimate. Everything is in coordination with the authorities. And we help them plant trees.
You mentioned the Arab expansion in Area C. How does your work in that respect differ from another great organization, Regavim?
Well, we all work hand in hand, obviously. All the great organizations like Regavim, we're very close ideological allies as well as friends. Specifically, the advantage called the boots on the ground. We have the activists to do it. And that Regavim does such amazing work, especially they do a lot of legal work. They expose everything that's going on. But we actually have people to physically go to these places and actually to film this going on and also to go ahead and plant the trees. So that's really the difference between the two organizations. But like I said, we work hand in hand.
Let's change subject. What progress have you made in preventing the BDS supporting Professor Goldreich to receive the Israel Prize?
So just to start from the beginning, for those who aren't familiar, there's a radical anti-Israel professor in the Weizmann Institute named Professor Oded Goldreich. Really a brilliant man, has many amazing accomplishments. But at the same time, he's a radical anti-Israel professor. He supports BDS. So we essentially exposed the fact that not only he signed a petition in 2019 condemning Germany's resolution comparing BDS to anti-Semitism, but just as recently as several weeks ago, that he signed a petition to boycott Ariel University. So we exposed this. We got the message to the former now education minister, Yoav Gallant, and then he decided to cancel the Israel Prize that was going to go to Goldreich. The Israel Prize is the most prestigious prize in Israel. It's also given by the government, and it's also funded by the government because it also includes a prize. And we said, if you support boycotting the state of Israel, you shouldn't get rewards from the state of Israel. You have your freedom of expression. You want to talk and express your views, that's fine. It doesn't mean that the state, it doesn't mean that the taxpayer, that me and you need to reward that.
So is that now decided that he doesn't get the Israel Prize?
So what happened was that Yoav Gallant, the former education minister, he decided to cancel it. But of course, we live in a country where the High Court unfortunately has the last say, and that's a whole separate subject. But the High Court, it was essentially the Israel Prize Selection Committee. They petitioned to the High Court, and they said, listen, we want to give this prize to this pro-BDS professor. What can we do? So recently, the High Court said that the new education minister now has 21 days to decide if she wants to uphold Gallant's decision or she wants to go ahead and give it to this BDS professor. So now we're just waiting for 21 days to see what she decides.
What's your agenda for the future?
The way that we see it is we really aim, and one of the aims from the very beginning was really establishing the next generation of Zionist elite. What do I mean by elite? I mean the people who are going to influence the culture, who are going to influence the media, even the courts, because the way that we see it now is that you have a large group of anti-Zionist elite, and they're the ones that are essentially leading the culture, the media, the high court, the society organizations, as well as academia. It's very difficult to impact change, to push the government, their elected officials to do things when you have this overarching umbrella of anti-Zionist elite who are essentially dictating the terms to the public. So let's say, just for example, the government wants to go ahead and expel the illegal migrant workers who are in South Tel Aviv. And they've been trying time and time again to do that. And every time that they do it, there's a large outcry in academia. The cultural figures come out. The media comes out against it. So it's very hard to try to promote your agenda when you have this bulwark defending against it, opposing it.
So now, importantly, Etan, how is Im Tirtzu funded?
So Im Tirtzu is funded by regular people, pro-Israel people, Zionists. We have a lot of donors, people who just, they give the 18 shekels, $18, people who really just support the cause. And that's why we need support. People always take for granted a lot of nonprofit organizations. They think they're always there. They don't realize that if they don't get the support, they're just going to disappear one day.
So if one wants to get in touch with Im Tirtzu, either to participate in your work or to help in other ways, maybe financially, how does one find you?
Well, firstly, you could always send me an email, and that's Eitan, which is EYTAN, at imt.org.il. That's IMTI.org.il. Or you can visit our website, which is www.imt.org.il/EN for English. And you could go there, you could find more information, you could support us, give a tax-deductible donation. And of course, any support, whether monetary or not, would be very much appreciated.
And when you do, please don't forget to mention that you heard it on this program. Eitan Meir, I appreciate your time and thank you for having been my guest.
Thank you so much for having me.
Arutz Sheva News Service reports that Diaspora Affairs Minister Nachman Shai, Labour, has announced that the new government is committed to the State of Israel becoming open to all three streams of Judaism, Orthodox, Conservative and Reform, and will recognize them all equally. The implications of this announcement are wide-reaching. They concern, among others, marriage, divorce, and most importantly, conversion. If this would, God forbid, ever be passed into law, Jewish life in Israel as we know it and respect it today would become a free-for-all, like filling in a form, getting a stamp, and your new status as a Jew is confirmed. I've already reported on reform conversions in a previous program, stating the reform requirements in the U.S., where it's up to the local community rabbi to set the conversion standard. In some cases, there's no requirement for immersion in a ritual bath, and worse still, no circumcision. That is the future if this government is allowed to continue its liberal policies. Ministries for votes is the order of the day. Defense Minister Lapid is authorizing to sell off more of the country's treasures. Housing and Construction Minister Zev Elkin has offered United Arab List Chairman Mansour Abbas the position of Deputy Minister in his ministry in exchange for supporting the family reunification law. If passed, that would flood Israel with masses of Arabs claiming to be dependents. And that position would also enable him to have a powerful voice in Bedouin expansion in the Negev and the freeze of Jewish construction in Judea and Samaria. The religious Zionism party said that, and I quote, "If it was not clear to anyone yet, the patchwork government set up by Bennett to fulfill his personal desires will do everything to survive, even at the cost of selling all of Israel's national and security interests." This spring, a new buzzword has exploded onto the American public arena, CRT, critical race theory. It has always been accepted that the human species is divided into distinct groups on the basis of inherited physical and behavioral differences, until today, when CRT has been awakened from its slumber since it was first written about in the early 1980s. It is an intellectual movement and loosely organized framework of legal analysis based on the premise that race is not a natural biologically grounded feature of physically distinct subgroups of human beings, but a socially constructed and culturally invented category that is used to oppress and exploit colored minorities. Critical race theorists hold that the law and legal institutions in the United States are inherently racist insofar as they function to create and maintain social, economic, and political inequalities between whites and non-whites, especially African Americans. CRT's most dangerous practical applications manifest themselves in the educational field, where already in second grade, white children are being enlightened about disadvantaged black children. And I shall contrast the underprivileged poor whites. But more about all that in another program. Now, change of subject. Much like non-stick pans is derived from items developed for space travel or military purposes. The latest innovation are drones, up to the size of a fighter plane or a Piper Seneca. Commercially available small drones used as toys are also an emerging threat. They can be used to annoy and disturb. So what is a drone? Essentially, a drone is an unmanned aerial vehicle, for short UAV, a flying robot that can be remotely controlled or adapted to fly autonomously through software-controlled flight plans in their embedded systems, working in conjunction with onboard sensors and GPS. They're used as weapons of war. Drones are transforming warfare by the use of artificial intelligence, drone swarms, and surveillance, leading to competition between the US, China, Israel, and Iran. In his new book, Drone Wars, Seth J. Franzman asks, who will be the next drone superpower, and takes the reader from the midnight exercises with Israel's elite drone warriors to the CIA headquarters, where new drone technology was once adopted in the 1990s to hunt Osama bin Laden. Drones are everywhere. Stay tuned, more about drones coming up.
In a time where feelings have become fact, where rational thought and common sense has disappeared, one man stands above it all.
I'm Howie Sobiker, your political hitman.
Political Hitman airs every Tuesday at 11:59 p.m. North American time, 7 a.m. Israeli time, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
and me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Drones are everywhere. from the deserts of Iraq, where terrorists are hunted by American drones, to Tehran, where plots are hatched against Israel, to the coast of China, where spy drones hide among the clouds. Drone wars are now unfolding. The competition to design faster, stealthier and deadlier technologies pits the US, Iran, Russia, Turkey, Israel and China against each other. In the battle for the streets of Mosul in Iraq, drones, in the hands of ISIS terrorists, made life hell for the Iraqi army and civilians. Today, defense companies are racing to develop the lasers, microwave weapons, and technology necessary for confronting the next drone threat. Israel has already perfected laser technology to down drones. This rapidly expanding technology could be used to target nuclear power plants and pose a threat to civilian airports. In the Middle East, the US used a drone to kill Iranian arch-terrorist Qasem Soleimani, a key Iranian commander. Drones are transforming the battlefield from Syria to Libya and Yemen. For militaries and security agencies, the main users of expensive drones, the UAV market is expanding as well. There were more than 20,000 military drones in use by 2020, writes Franzmann. Once the province of only a few militaries, drones now being built in Turkey, China, Russia and smaller countries like Taiwan may be joining the military drone market. It's big business too. $100 billion will be spent over the next decade on drones. Militaries may soon be spending more on drones than tanks, much as navies transitioned away from giant vulnerable battleships to more agile ships. The future wars will be fought with drones and won by whoever has the most sophisticated technology. In just 285 pages, Franzmann takes us back to the pioneers who developed drones in Israel and the US and how this invention became the most controversial and necessary weapon of the past decade. But he also captures the implications of these UAVs in the future. At the book launch, which took place this week at the prestigious Jerusalem Press Club, the author explained how this rapidly expanding technology could be used to target nuclear power plants and pose a threat to civilian airports, and in its miniature form used by the paparazzi in pursuit of their celebrity targets, to mention just three. This is how Seth Franzmann explained such technology at the book launch.
Well, think, for instance, of a drone scanning terrorists. And instead of having a human operator sit there and watch the screen all day and go to sleep and drink 1,000 cups of coffee, instead of that, you program the algorithms and all this so that the drone begins to identify patterns of behavior. So that the drone, for instance, can warn the guy who's supposed to be drinking all those cups of coffee, hey, look, we've got a truck, and every time this truck comes, it stays for 5 minutes, and it's very suspicious. All the other vehicles do something that seems normal, but this one vehicle does something that's different. Or, for instance, you can identify an RPG in the back of the truck based on the drone has been trained through algorithms to differentiate between a grenade and a cup of water. So it all of a sudden tells the guy, wake up, there's an RPG in the back of that truck. That's not supposed to be there.
This book will give you a glimpse into one of the technologies that will shape our world. Drone Wars by Seth J. Franzmann is published by Bombardier Books and is available in all good book outlets. Israel's harassed population is rejoicing in the knowledge that the COVID-19 virus has been almost totally eradicated in our country. Restrictions have been lifted, with the exception at points of entry, and we could finally recognize each other without masks. And now all is changing again. Masks are back, because some irresponsible travelers arriving from red countries and carrying the more virulent Delta COVID mutation, formerly known as the Indian variant, have flouted the quarantine regulations and infected some of their contacts. That strain is reported to be around 50% more contagious than the original strain. More than 40 cases are hospitalized. Even cases of vaccinated persons have been reported. Israel's health officials are now considering the next step. For more than a year, travel around the world has been severely curtailed and its industry decimated. So just when in Israel it looked promising that tourism, so necessary for our economy, is beginning to start, we again have concerns. To find out about the travel situation for Israelis, and indeed for the tourist industry, I visited this program's trusted travel agent Mark Feldman of Zion Tours in Jerusalem to find out more. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's been a very long time since you were talking with me about the travel scene, and we know that, like everybody, your industry has had great difficulties to survive. How did your company fare?
Like the entire tourism industry, whether it's hotels or tour guides, we've been decimated. Of the 38 people that I have on staff, all of them were put on unpaid leave back in March. I was only able to bring back 3 people just a couple of months ago and another 2. It's not going to change. We understand that the vast majority of people, they're either afraid of traveling or they simply don't want to take a risk. So much of the world has been shut off. China, India, Canada, many parts of Europe. The one surprising area that really took us by storm was once the approval requirements were dropped, there was a committee that you had to ask permission to leave the country, something that we had never had in our entire existence. Once that was dropped, people, like mushrooms after the rain, like a cork in a champagne bottle, exploded, and they had to get out of the country. They had to go to the United States. And it was an outpouring of something that I've never seen in my entire career. That has continued constantly, without fail, until last night. Last night, the Prime Minister went on television and asked the people not to fly. He actually said, we would prefer you to stay at home. The Health Ministry sent out a directive this morning. Anybody who is coming into this country on a plane, and there's one person on the plane with COVID-19, even if vaccinated, they will have to do a 14-day quarantine. I've seen a lot the last 15 months, so it's not a surprise. We were very excited this winter with the Abraham Accords, with the United Arab Emirates, and we were sending dozens and dozens of people there. Everything is now again frozen.
As you said, I see most of your many consultants' desks are still closed. So how do you see the present and indeed the future?
It's going to be a long-term recovery. I think the leisure travelers will come back this year.
But
there are no congresses planned in 21. There are no conferences. But our business travelers, they will not be flying in large numbers until 22.
When we talk about travel, we must include the tourist industry, which in 2019 amounted to 5.9% of GDP. In your estimation, how long will it take to get to near pre-COVID level?
A good 12 to 18 months, provided we have no more setbacks like we just are experiencing right now, as you said, with the Delta variant.
A major component of the tourist industry is accommodation, and many hotels were closed. Yet I saw much new hotel construction in Jerusalem. Does that mean that the industry expects a surge and there are not enough rooms?
There's not enough rooms when we come back to normal tourism. These hotels were approved 2-3 years ago and are only now starting to build. We do anticipate that in a couple of years our numbers will be massive. What happened in the United Arab Emirates and other countries shows us that, politically speaking, we can survive anything. The problem is the prices of hotels today are 30-40% higher than they were 2 years ago.
I thought they would be lower because there's not that much occupancy.
You would think so, because don't forget there's no tourists in this country. What happened is, because so many Israelis don't want to fly abroad because they don't want to risk getting sick there or to come back and do quarantine, they've decided to vacation in Israel. And the hotels have taken full advantage by marking up the prices. A lot is sold out for the entire summer. You can't get a room in a hotel until after the high holidays.
So while we're talking about Israelis traveling abroad, let's talk about Abu Dhabi. I believe that you were there, but I suppose in a professional capacity. Is that a flash in the pan, or is it a serious destination for the future, and why?
I think that Dubai, more than Abu Dhabi, in the United Emirates, is going to continue to be very popular, more so in the winter when the weather is much nicer. It's a different thing that most of us and most of your listeners cannot experience. It's not a Western country. It's not an Asian country. It's a country all of its own, which is incredibly service-oriented. And most surprisingly, they really like Israel.
Well, I heard that there is still serious opposition in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, against allying with Israel. Would you take your family there?
I would have no problem taking my family there. We have sent bar mitzvah trips there, weddings there. The ability to get kosher food there exists. And again, I think in the business world, they like us. Whether the population or the man on the street isn't. Keep in mind one thing about the United Arab Emirates, 90% of the population are foreigners. So there's very few Emiratis there. In fact, all the businesses are run by Palestinians, Indians, South Africans, Germans with an Emirati partner. So I actually found them unbelievably accommodating, unbelievably happy and wonderful with us.
The Prime Minister and several of his ministers visited Ben Gurion Airport and decided on new entry and exit regulations, including expensive tests. Do you think that's necessary?
We're the only country in the world that requires when you land in our country, you be tested. Let's take, for example, the United States or the United Kingdom. To get into those countries, you must, within 72 hours of your flight, have a COVID-19 test. Once you're there, you're fine. In the UK, they ask you to be tested on your second day. That's it. Nobody requires you of those countries when you come back that you need to be tested a third time. Only Israel requires a COVID-19 test to get on the plane, another test to get back on the plane, and a third test when you land here. This costs a lot of money. To try to arrange these tests when you're in the United States or in the United Kingdom is quite expensive. I'm not sure why, and health officials have not made it clear to me why we need a test upon arrival if we were just tested within 72 hours of our return flight. We are the only country that has such a demand.
True, but the reward is that we are also the most successful country in the world to combat COVID.
Yeah, but as you said in your opening, Walter, the reason that infections came is because people came into this country with COVID and they skipped it or they were never tested until it was too late. If we require them to be tested beforehand and it's reported, this shouldn't happen. There's no excuse that they were allowed to get on the plane from India or Russia or whatever. It's a very dangerous thing. I have a group in Morocco today. My tour guide, a young man of 64 years old, vaccinated, is in hospital with COVID-19, even though he got the vaccination and everything.
Very regrettable, but then the whole group would need to go into quarantine on return. That's how we keep the country clean.
I understand what they're doing. I'm just concerned with the testing at the airport. The fact that last Friday, before Shabbat, 2,300 people were allowed to leave and not be tested whatsoever shows you that we're not doing something right. It's not working the way we have it set up. We have to have it done much more efficiently.
Mark, you know it much better than I do that the onus to carry those people is on the airline. It's their responsibility.
I'm flying next week, and I'm going to go on Friday with the drive-through to get my test, being able to enter the United States. That works really well. The test before you leave is very efficient. It's 10 minutes. Yes, it costs 44 shekels, $12, but for me, that's worth it. It's the coming back that's very chaotic, disorganized, and quite expensive.
So having regard to the COVID numbers in many countries, are people booking as usual, and which are the favored destinations? Before you answer, let me read you from the latest that I heard today. In any areas of Ben Gurion Airport, the wearing of face masks is now obligatory. According to the latest report, following the revelation of that thousands of travelers are returning to Israel from countries they are forbidden to visit, according to Health Ministry directives, many of them are bringing coronavirus back with them, and the Ministry is planning stricter enforcement of the rules. All those travelling abroad will be required to fill out an online form declaring that they will not be flying to any of the 6 countries currently on the banned list. That's Russia, India, Mexico, South Africa, Brazil and Argentina, and that their final destination is not one of the 6 countries. Travellers returning from abroad will also be questioned on their country of origin, and those who are found with stamps in their passports from one of the 6 banned countries will be fined 5,000 shekels. What's your comment?
It's a pity that we've had this list of countries. It was 8, now it's 6, have been in effect for 2 months. It's sad that so many planes were coming in, for example, Russia, and nobody was ever checked. This should have been done. We spoke about a fine back then of 3,500 shekels. Now it's been raised to 5,000 shekels. What I've yet to see is anybody enforced. I know they're doing it because I have many, many clients who have told me that they've circumvented that thing when they've landed to avoid it. I don't understand why they're getting away with it. If we're going to do this, more power to it. The Prime Minister announced that he was going to assign 200 more police to Ben Gurion Airport to go after these people. I hope that he does it. It is necessary. It is just pure selfishness that people are trying to do this and risking the health of this nation after we've come so far to put the pandemic behind us.
So which are the favorite destinations?
It's not so much the favorite destinations where we can go. The U.S. has always been open to Israel from the beginning. Europe was closed. The U.K. was closed. South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, completely closed. So there were very few countries. So without a doubt, American Airlines started flying here a month and a half ago because the United States is the #1 market for the Israelis.
Finally, where do we go from here? Can the industry survive further restrictions? And what's the prognosis for the Israeli traveller? Is it just going to be the Kinneret and the Dead Sea?
I want to believe that we've learned a lot, that in spite of this last setback, that if the Prime Minister and the Health Ministry and the Police Ministry work hard, we can put this behind us. We have to put this behind us. We're starting to roll out vaccinations for teenagers. There's a lot of talk whether it's safe or not safe, but health officials are starting to say it's very safe and worthwhile. The more people that we vaccinate, the better the country will be. Where we decide to go abroad, I'm not sure. Will Israelis pay the astronomical prices? Yes, we've seen in the past they will. We have to be patient. We have to believe.
And with those thoughts, I've run out of time. Mark Feldman of Zion Toast, Jerusalem, thank you for coming on the program, and I appreciate your time. Finally, a few interesting birthdays. The 25th of June in 1903 brought George Orwell into the world. His famous book, 1984, published in 1949, became reality. The singers Carly Simon, born 1945, and the late George Michaels, was born in 1963, both have their birthdays today. And that's it for today. God willing, I'll be back again next week, same time, same place, with more from Israel and the rest of the Jewish world. Until then, thanks for listening, and this is Walter Bingham wishing you a good and COVID-free week. Please also ensure that your elderly neighbor is all right. Thank you. Goodbye.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
Howdy, this is Rita from League City, Texas, now living in Israel. And though my heart may have belonged to Texas, it now belongs to Israel and all the fantastic show hosts at Israel News Talk Radio.
Hi, this is Michael Solomon from Kiryat Arba, Israel. And why do I love listening to Israel News Talk Radio? Because I love listening to the interesting interviews they do and their news reporting that most other media sources don't cover.
Hey, this is Nicoleko from Malmö, Sweden. It gets pretty cold here in Sweden, so I love cuddling up with a warm cup of tea while I listen to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey everybody, this is Frank Morris from Tennessee. Me and my dog Buster really love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.